very honored to be here with my friend Richard Haass. And I'm here for a couple of reasons. The first is that Richard and I go really far back. I don't want to tell you how far back, but we met when we were 21 years old, and you can do the math. And so I've been Richard's friend and have followed his thinking, agreeing with some, disagreeing with some over the years, but he's always been my friend. But I'm here because I was very excited about this book, Foreign Policy Begins at Home, from the very moment I heard the title, and then from the first conversation I had with Richard about it. Richard and I were colleagues together at the Brookings Institution, and actually the first question I'm going to ask of you, Richard, is, given this title, why don't you just merge the Council on Foreign Relations with the Brookings Institution? Because that would be a very logical thing to do in light of the title. But I think this book makes an argument that I believe we need to hear, and that I think a lot of Americans will actually resonate to. I read the book, Richard, and I wondered, is this your manifesto to run for president? So I can ask him that question too, and when he is at all equivocal, we can know that he is running for president.
EJ, I am president.
I was going to get to that. I just want to read a couple of lines from the book, which I think summarize it. Americans will not enjoy the standard of living or quality of life they aspire to at home amid chaos abroad, and the United States will not be in a position to limit chaos abroad unless it rebuilds the foundations of its strength at home. And then later on, he said the objective must be to take advantage of the opportunity we have now, which Richard calls a strategic respite, to restore the foundations of American power, including the economy, the schools, infrastructure. I think that we should be grateful that Richard has joined the debate in this way. As you know, Richard is the president of the Council on Foreign Relations. He's worked in almost every administration in our lifetime. He is the author and editor of, editor of 12 books. And I will start by asking you why not merge the CFR with Brookings. But what I really want to do is ask you, what pushed you in this direction? There are those who say that this is an isolationist book. I have read it. It's not an isolationist book. I want you to begin by defending yourself against that charge and just explain, how did you come to this?
Well, let me say at the beginning, it's not a book I ever imagined I'd write. Here I am. I'm lucky enough to be president of the Council on Foreign Relations. I've spent 4 decades toiling in what you might call the foreign policy national security vineyard. Like many others in this room, I grew up during the Cold War. And yet I got to this point. What did it was really 2 things. If I had to sum it up in a sentence, it's because the United States has overreached abroad and we've underperformed at home. And I'm worried as a result. I think we overreached abroad over the last few decades, first in Iraq, and then secondly in Afghanistan, when we tried to remake that country. And as I watch some of the debates going on about Syria, I'm concerned that we don't seem to have lost that. We don't seem to have learned that lesson. Indeed, as recently as today in the New York Times, people were saying it's time already to get over Iraq. Gee, I don't want to get over Iraq. I want to learn the lessons of Iraq, and I want to apply those lessons. So I'm worried that the United States is seriously overreached and has been, it's allowed its foreign policy to get distorted, with this emphasis in particular on the Middle East, in particular on remaking the Middle East, which I simply believe is neither possible nor is strategically wise, given the other things we have to do in Asia, in this part of the world, in North America. But then it gets me to the second half of the argument. I'm also worried about what we're doing and not doing here at home. And I can't believe any observer of the American political scene would conclude differently. If one looks at what we haven't done dealing with the deficit, if one looks at the fact that we're growing at a rate that's roughly half the post-World War II historical average, if anyone's landed in recent memory at LaGuardia or Kennedy Airport, I rest my case on infrastructure. If I know a lot of kids line up around the world to get into Harvard, Yale, Princeton, or Stanford, I haven't noticed long lines of children around the world trying to come into the United States to attend our elementary schools, our public schools. So there are some real challenges here at home, and I'm worried that our politics are simply not up to sorting them out. So I wrote the book essentially to make the case for what we need to do abroad and what we need to do at home and what we need to stop doing abroad and stop doing at home, but also to help people sort it out. It's a complicated world. This is a far more complicated world than the world I alluded to a second ago, the Cold War. And what I've tried to do is write something of blueprints to strong of her, but a guide to essentially, for citizens as well as policymakers, for sorting out the challenges of the 21st century.
One of the things, by the way, you'll learn in the book is that 10 years ago we were 5th in the world in infrastructure, and now we're 24th in the world, which goes to Richard's point. Let's go straight to the Middle East. When I read those parts of the book where you talked about the need to readjust toward Asia, you disliked the word pivot, which you can explain. I was thinking we may no longer be as interested as we used to be in the Middle East, but the Middle East always seems interested in us. And that a lot of, this administration very clearly wants to make the move toward Asia, is trying to make that move, and yet issues in the Middle East keep coming back. Sure. How do we actually manage to make that move, given all the problems that you described so well in the book that exist in the Middle East?
Well, the analogy that comes to mind for those of you who like to stay up at night watching films is Michael in Godfather 3. And he basically says, every time I try to leave, they keep pulling me back. Well, that wasn't just him with the mafia, that's us with the Middle East. We say we want to pivot or rebalance towards Asia or other parts of the world, and then suddenly we wake up and the headlines are Libya, Syria, Iran, what have you. But foreign policy, like all public policy, is about choosing. Foreign policy, like all public policy, is about priorities. To borrow from the business literature, it's sometimes about not letting the urgent crowd out the important. And what we have to do is look at not simply the Middle East, or to use the cliche, one square on the chessboard. We've got to look at the entire chessboard. And we've got to look at the Middle East compared to everything else we may want to do in other parts of the world or here at home. But also we've got to know something about the Middle East. One of the things we ought to have learned from Vietnam, from Iraq, and from Afghanistan is we can sit around inside the Beltway and debate this or that generalization or foreign policy abstraction, but at some point it comes up against local realities, geographic, historical, cultural, political, economic. There are real realities in the Middle East, and we may say we want Syria in the next 6 months or year to be a peaceful, thriving democracy where everybody's reading the Federalist Papers in Arabic translation. No, fine. I wish you well. Ain't going to happen. And then as a result, we've got to adjust our foreign policy accordingly. Or to put it another way, if we had had this meeting a decade ago or 15 years ago, and we had had a show of hands, inconceivable that we would have predicted that U.S. foreign policy in this post-Cold War era would involve going to war first in Iraq and then Afghanistan, parts of the greater Middle East. That essentially this was going to be where the United States was going to use its discretionary power. This was how we were going to use the peace dividend. We were going to try to remake this part of the world. It's what we did, but this seems to me to be totally inconsistent with any notion of strategy.
This goes back to your other book, but you were in the administration that went to war in Iraq. Why was it so difficult to stop the war in Iraq, to stop the direction of the administration? There are a lot of people in there, you and Colin Powell and Richard Armitage, all had grave doubts about what we were doing before we did it. What led us there? Why could that not be stopped?
It's something I've written a lot about actually in a previous book, but all the three people you mentioned all happened to be in one building, the State Department. The last I checked, there were several other buildings involved in the making of foreign policy, beginning with the White House. And after 9/11, there were those around the president, and I think the president signed on to this as well, that he wanted to do something that would send a message to the world that we were not a pitiful, helpless giant, to use Mr. Nixon's phrase. There was also the view that was argued by some, which I thought was preposterous, that Iraq was ripe for democracy. It was going to be easily instituted there.